So let's see. Tell me if you can see this.
Yes, I can.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. I feel like this is like the third time maybe I was supposed to talk to people in linguistics at Lancaster, and they keep getting canceled for things like strikes and other natural disasters. So third time's a charm. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm I guess usually I'll say something along the lines of behavioral scientist or behavioral analyst here at Lancaster. And this is always kind of a strange position to be in, talking to people across disciplines, in that, you know, I'm never entirely sure what it is that your interests might be, or where it is that we can find some common ground. So, you know, I'll start off by just getting a bit into some of how we talk about and think about language from where I'm coming from a kind of psychological, personality, social sciences type of perspective that often is a very different way of approaching language than what you might expect in something like linguistics. So these days, as Gloriana said, most of my research involves looking at things like personality, motivation, emotions, things like that, through the lens of people's words, or what we would say their verbal behavior. Now, when I'm talking about verbal behavior in the context of my research, really most of the work that I do falls under this broad umbrella of the psychology of verbal behavior, which really what we mean by this is what can people's words tell us about their underlying psychological processes? What does a person's language, and I mean language in kind of the broadest way possible, what does it tell us about a person's thoughts, their feelings, their behaviors, their subjective experiences, and so on? And I say language to mean virtually anything. You know, the actual words that they say, the things that people write, the things that people type, even the words in someone's environment. So treating other people's verbal behavior as the kind of atmosphere through which you're moving in your day-to-day life. And really, all of this work is coming from a personality and social psychology perspective. So what this means is that when we're analyzing people's language, often what we're doing is treating these as relatively stable indicators about a person's psychology in general. So we're taking this fundamental behavior, the use of language, verbalization, and we're co-opting it to use it for other purposes, to try to probe deeper parts of people's minds, essentially. So, for example, in personality psychology, one of the classic and fairly robust findings is that use of first-person singular pronouns is pretty modestly but reliably correlated with things like depression. And so we might go and collect a sample of individuals and measure how often they're self-referencing throughout the day, what percentage of their pronouns are first-person singular pronouns, and so on, and try to use that as a measure of whether or not they're a narcissist, whether or not they're depressed, variations in that over time. Do people who are self-referencers fundamentally think differently than low self-referencers? Do they respond to different message framings in different ways, and so on? Now, all this is grounded on some pretty basic principles that probably all of you are familiar with, and this is something I usually go through when I'm talking with psychologists. So the underlying assumptions behind all of the work on psychology and verbal behavior is that words in some way or another reflect and kind of shape our subjective psychological experiences. So at the most basic level, words just correspond to these concepts and experiences. And therefore, when we're measuring things about people's psychology through their words, we just kind of assume that there's a fairly broad, maybe general relationship between people's vocabularies and what their minds are doing. And there are some core theories that we draw from when we talk about this. We talk about how we use language as a window to people's mental habits. So you can think about this as the kind of classic carpenter's toolbox metaphor, where the verbal behaviors we engage in most habitually, the vocabularies we use most often, and so on, are words that perhaps most directly reflect our most prevalent experiences, thought patterns, emotional patterns, and so on. If we use lots of positive emotion words, it's probably because we experience positive emotions more regularly than people who don't use those tools as often. We also generally talk about how people's language reflects their interests and expertise as they're moving through the world. You all probably want to jump through a window every time you hear someone say, like, oh, don't the Inuit people have 50 words for snow? Which is kind of drawn from this general idea that humans are fundamentally interested in the world around them and their own psychological experiences, and so our words reflect that. So even though a lot of this has become kind of mythologized, there's still kind of research and some classic linguistic theory we draw from to make this a leap between taking a person's verbal behaviors and making psychological inferences from those. And then ultimately, there's also kind of this bidirectional influence between verbal behavior and people's subjective experiences. So, like, you know, nobody is taking the strong morphine approach here, but there is a pretty good amount of research, especially in the past decade or so, on things like emotion labeling, how we talk about our emotions and how we feel, and how that shapes our future emotional experiences as well. So a personality psychologist might also call this something like definitional truth. So if you're looking to understand how you're feeling, you might assign a label to a certain mood or emotion, happiness or sadness or something like that. And once you have assigned that label, it actually shapes then how you understand that experience, and it becomes this kind of cascading process. Now, more directly with where I'm coming from, often we talk about language as just another psychological measure. So if we're trying to measure things about a person, if we're trying to understand things like personality or prejudice or aggression, how people make decisions and judgments, there are a bunch of different ways we can operationalize and measure any one of those constructs. And so we might do that with something like self-report questionnaires, we might use observer reports, or some kind of a laboratory study where we have an objective behavior that, that we treat as mapping onto a certain psychological process. And from this perspective, language is just yet another one of these types of things. So from a behavioral sciences perspective, language just fits in this broader category of different types of behaviors that we use to understand people. And so while a lot of my work, I think you guys can see my mouse moving around with the screen share. You know, from my perspective, I'm doing a lot of behavioral science, so I'm not just looking at language. It's often looking at how language fits into the broader behavioral patterns that fit under a person's psychology. Now, put more simply, we can say that language is just one of many types of behaviors, and lucky for us, we can also use that behavior to infer pretty well other things that are going on in a person's psychology, their emotions, their cognitive patterns, and so on. Now, perhaps counterintuitively, despite the fact that most of my work is with language, I'm actually not that interested in language itself. I'm at my heart, in my heart of hearts, I'm a psychologist, and what I really care about is the stuff that goes on in people's minds, what their experiences are, how that relates to their actual behaviors, what they do in different contexts, and so on. And just so happens that language is a convenient avenue to get to all of these things I actually care about. Now, I'm giving you that big disclaimer because there's probably going to be some stuff I say, especially when I talk about the actual language analysis components. They're just going to irritate some people in the audience. I'm not trying to irritate you. I just want you to understand that we're coming from a very different perspective. I'm looking often at the same types of data that a linguist might look at, or even in some cases, computer scientists, information scientists, and so on. I'm just using it to go in a very different direction for a fundamentally different goal. And so, you know, if I say anything that just offends your deepest sensibilities and you're coming from a linguistics background, I apologize in advance. And once all the social distancing stuff is over, then you can track me down and beat me up in a dark alley somewhere for sullying the good use of language. Now, today what I'm going to talk about specifically is one project in particular that Gloriana mentioned, narratives. Narratives as a very specific type of verbal behavior. Now, narratives are one of these things that there's a lot of different definitions. It depends on who you talk to and what discipline they're coming from, and even often what subdisciplines they're working in terms of what they consider a narrative. I'm talking about narratives in a very casual sense here. You know, we can also call them stories. I'm probably going to use the terms interchangeably. And, you know, from where I'm coming from, that's okay. I'm not using some ultra strict definition of what a narrative is here, but I'm using this term broadly to talk about how we tell each other stories and how we structure our stories. If you take off your academic hat and you just think of the term narrative, that's what I'm talking about. And one reason why we study them is because they're ubiquitous. They permeate pretty much all facets of our lives. We tell stories to teach lessons. We tell stories to help people understand our perspectives, to convey morals and ideals and values. We use stories to kind of pass on information in a very particular way across generations. And narratives have a really long academic history, definitely outside of psychology. So, you know, you can trace a lot of narrative research back to kind of Aristotle's thinking on storytelling narratives. And even within psychology, from around the time that psychology itself was kind of coalescing into an academic discipline, and certainly through the 1960s onward, there's a really long, interesting, kind of weird history in psychology where narratives were thought to be really important to understanding just the basic fundamentals of why people are how they are. Now, most of the theories in psychology on narratives people don't really take them that seriously anymore. There's a lot of really kind of mushy, archaic, psychodynamic type of stuff, very, you know, Freudian and neo-Freudian theories that have since fallen out of favor. But across all of these different lines of inquiry, there's been a renewed interest in studying narratives and looking at narratives using more modern computational approaches. So trying to understand narratives in a way from a distance, where we don't have to go and kind of pore over volumes of text and form subjective understandings of what they are and what they're trying to do. Now, there are a few recent examples from the past decade or so where people have really started doing this to some, I'd say to some success. So one of the more prominent people in this area for a while now has been Franco Moretti, who was founder of Stanford's Lit Lab. And they've published a bunch of pamphlets over the years. I think they still publish them that fall squarely under what we might call a digital humanities perspective. So trying to take text and use computational or objective methods and understand things about those texts. So they've done work like mapping out the social networks of characters and plays and things like that. Another good example is work by Matthew Jockers, where they do things like quantify the emotional trajectories within a given story to try to help understand the emotional structure and how the story unfolds over time. Perhaps most recently, there's some work by Andy Reagan, who I think now is somewhere out in California. This is work that he did as a graduate student, where they did essentially longitudinal clustering of emotional trajectories across stories to try to understand how emotions are kind of fundamental to different types of stories. So stories that start with really low or kind of, we'll say, negative tone or negative sentiment, and then evolve into positive sentiment, map onto a rags to riches kind of archetype. Whereas the opposite, going from highly negative, going from highly positive to highly negative, is more of the riches to rags archetype, and so on. Now, most of this falls under the distant reading banner, where all of this is still trying to explore literary theory and try to measure things about texts from a distance in order to fit them into a literary theoretical perspective or literary criticism perspective. And these are all interesting, and there's a lot of really good work here. But none of this is really what tickles my interest when we're looking at narratives and this idea of telling stories from a psychological perspective. None of these really hit home with me in terms of understanding the psychological or the social psychological function of stories, how stories actually operate psychologically in terms of how information is conveyed, or really understanding the psychological machinery of narratives as this specific subtype of verbal behaviors. Now, we can still start from a literary perspective when we're talking about how we understand narratives from a psychological perspective. So this figure that you see here, you've probably all had this drilled into you since grade school at least. This is a representation of the classic Freytag's pyramid. So this is often used to teach people this is what the structure of stories should be like, or sometimes this is what the structure of all stories kind of is in one form or another, even when there's some variation around this. Now, typically when people talk about this pyramid or this narrative structure, they treat these as kind of discrete destinations that you move to. A story starts off and we're at the exposition. So I'm here giving you all this background information. Then once that's done, we move on to the next destination, which is action. So now I'm going to have all these things start happening and build up to the climax, which we arrive at. Again, these are all kind of separate things that happen. We're here, then we're here, then we're here. Now, another way to think about this is more of an ongoing process. So a narrative isn't just dimensions. These are different psychological processes unfolding, or even just information conveyance processes unfolding. And really what we're talking about here then is looking at narratives as this ongoing verbal behavior that's involving this kind of fluid process that unfolds over time. And there are different ways that we can take this structure here and start to operationalize it as these unfolding verbal behaviors. And I'm going to be a bit hand-wavy on some of this. I'm happy to talk about any and all of this once we move into the Q&A period. But when we look at this structure, we want to think about it in terms of processes that are happening over time. We can talk about this structure being represented as three separate processes. The first process is something that we might call staging. So staging is going to be giving you kind of set up information that carries, that then the story builds on. So this is like the foundational background. So during an expository period in a story, I'm giving you all the information you need to know to make sense of the story kind of downstream. You know, I know maybe I'm just unlucky, but I think that a lot of us probably know several people in our lives where they don't have the strongest sense of how to tell a story, and so they'll just launch into a story, and you don't have any sense of like who the people are that they're talking about, what the context is, none of that. And so they'll just kind of start saying like, oh, you know, Sally did this last week and it was really funny, and then Joe did this, and you have to stop and say like, I don't know who the hell Sally is or who Joe is. this is a terrible story. I don't even know what you're talking about. I need the background information. So you can think about that as the staging process. Now, in theory, a story, or at least a functional story, should start high in this process. So if I sit down with you and first start telling you a story, whether that story is like a fairy tale or if it's like a very personal story about what I did this week, my life story, anything like this, you need that background information. So I'm going to start off this stream of verbal behaviors with a lot of kind of core foundation that you need to understand everything else I'm going to say. Now, unlike what this Freytag's pyramid model might suggest, doesn't mean that like I'm going to start off by giving you core information and then I just stop at some point and then move on. New information will continue, but it's going to probably follow this pattern here, where I start high with lots of kind of informational types of speech, and then it'll fall off. It won't go away, but it'll kind of wane. Now, once that's over, then I can start moving into telling you kind of what happened. You know the who's and the what's and the where's. And now I can start telling you what actually happened in the story. And this is something we call plot progression, the actual kind of carrying forward of the story or of the narrative. We'd expect that to follow essentially the inverse of the staging process, where I'm probably not going to start out a story by just kind of telling you what happened. You need to know the context first. So it'll probably start low and then pick up and either kind of continue to increase throughout a story or just level off at a certain point. Now the last one, this kind of core element that I think most people think of when they think of the pyramid is this climax, this conflict or this tension that arises. Now, there are a lot of different ways we can talk about how this can be reflected or operationalized from a psychological perspective, this conveyance of kind of stressors or problems or conflict or something like that. This is something that drawing from a long history in the psychology of verbal behavior, we might call it something like cognitive tension, and we would expect it probably to follow this actual kind of pyramid shape where stories usually would start with a low amount of tension, maybe not entirely absent of tension, but then it builds up to a climax, and once the climax is resolved, it would fall off. We can think about a narrative being these three different processes, all acting simultaneously to some degree or another, unfolding from the beginning to the end of the story. And so our very first question in this project was, can we actually see this? Can we actually take samples of language data and see these shapes unfold over the course of a story? And there are a lot of different ways you can do this, and we've tried a lot of them. They all essentially converge in the same way. I'm going to show you how we ultimately settled on doing this for the sake of computational simplicity. But essentially what we do is we take stories and we measure different classes of words as they occur throughout the duration of the story. To measure staging, we count up things like articles and prepositions as they occur throughout the story. For plot progression, we start using other function word categories, pronouns, adverbs, auxiliary verbs, and so on. And for cognitive tension, we use kind of a variation of what we often call cognitive processing words or just cognitive words in general. These are words that generally semantically fall in the ballpark of problem solving or question answering, things like that. These are generally words that reflect some kind of active thinking. Now, I can sense remotely that there's the linguists in the audience are probably squirming in your seats when you see these categories. We can talk about that. Trust me, there's other ways to go about this. But in general, I'll just do a quick walkthrough here of some of the logic. For staging, in general, articles and prepositions, what they're telling us are that people are referring to objects and their interrelations. So articles are, in this case, we treat them as noun noun signifiers. So most articles are going to be paired closely with nouns, whereas prepositions also paired closely with nouns, but tells about the relationships between the nouns. So this is, talking about the person I know. So Sally, who lives over there in this house on top of the hill next to this town, and so on. Now, once we've set up that background information, we can start moving away from nouns and into pronouns. So we know who the people are, we can refer to them in shorthand, and we also start talking about the things that they're doing. And some of the logic here is similar. Things like adverbs and auxiliary verbs. They are, we'll say, highly diagnostic of verb use. In a lot of ways, they parallel verb use as well. In cognitive attention words, this comes from a long history of psych research on this type of language, where what we find is that when people are stressed, when people are working through problems, they tend to use a lot of this type of language. And I say that in many senses. So not just problems like when you ask somebody to sit down and solve like a logic puzzle and have them think aloud. They use more of this type of language. But also just in everyday life, people who are depressed, people who are struggling, people with severe like stress disorders, they tend to use a lot more of this language in everyday life. Now, if we want to look at these processes in stories to see how they unfold, if they occur in these shapes that we would kind of expect them to, we need to collect a bunch of stories, a bunch of narratives, and then go through this process of actually measuring these processes from the language. And so in our first kind of set of questions, just asking, do these shapes exist? Can we measure them reliably? We collected a few very traditional corpora of traditional stories. So we collected a bunch of fiction novels from Project Gutenberg, specifically their 2010 DVD. We collected a bunch of short stories from all over the internet, a bunch of different kind of short story repositories, and these consist of both kind of amateur and professional short stories. And then we also have a big database that we've been collecting over the years of thematic apperception test writing. And these are, if you're not familiar with the TAT, this is a very kind of classic old school psychological test that most people don't really take seriously anymore, but it's a good prompt where we sit people down, we show them a picture like this one here with two women in lab coats, and we just say, tell us a story, tell us what's going on here. You know, who are these people? What are they doing? What are they thinking about? Just try to tell us a story about what's happening in this picture. And for this one specifically, you get a lot of stories about, these two women are curing cancer. Often things go horribly awry. They mix up the wrong things and end up, blowing up the planet or something like that. And so we have all of these different corpora of stories that kind of span time, context, formal versus informal, and so on. And then what we do is we take these stories, we chop them up into equal chunks. This project, we end up settling on 5 chunks, so we just literally take each text and then automatically chop it into 5 equally sized segments. And then we go into the first segment and we count the articles and prepositions, second segment, articles and prepositions, and so on. And we do this for each of those 3 processes: staging, plot progression, and cognitive attention. We do that for each of the 3 processes across the 5 segments for every single story. Now, there's some other stuff that we do here to normalize these numbers, and I can go into that if anybody's super curious about it. But that's essentially where this process led us. And we started with 5 just kind of arbitrarily, in that it's like, okay, well, the classic pyramid has 5 destinations, so we'll start there. But we've done a bunch of other analyses too, and actually it turns out it doesn't really matter if you do 5 or 10 or 3. They all converge on the same basic information. Now, when we do this across these 3 corpora, what we find are strikingly consistent patterns. So if we look at how staging unfolds across these 5 different segments, in novels, in short stories, and in these really short thematic apperception test writings, they all start crazy high on the staging process. They start with lots of articles and prepositions, and then very rapidly fall off. And they don't disappear, like I said before. They just kind of normalize down to much lower levels. So it's not that these storytellers are stopping with giving you new information. It's just that the amount of new information that comes along rapidly slows down after kind of this initial big explosion of background info. The essentially opposite is true when we look at these linguistic markers of plot progression, things like pronouns and auxiliary verbs. They start very, very low, and then they gradually, or I'm sorry, they pretty rapidly shoot up, and then kind of gradually climb, or in some cases kind of flatten out and stabilize. Lastly, cognitive tension. We see roughly what we expected there. It starts low, so all of the stories start with very low amounts of these kind of thinking, active processing words. And then they rise up, they crest at some point, roughly in the middle, although the TAT crests a bit earlier. And then they start to fall off towards the end of the story. And so when we line all of these up, what we see is those 3 processes unfolding in really shockingly consistent fashions across all of these narratives. These are thousands of narratives of wildly different lengths, right? So a lot of these novels are tens of thousands of words long. And the TATs are just hundreds of words long. And yet, when we chop them into these 5 bits, the exact same processes unfold in the exact same way. So to me, this was really, really shocking. It means that if you only, let's say, kind of give yourself 1,000 words to tell a story versus some really long form kind of Moby Dick length narrative, you dedicate roughly the same percentage of that story to each of these kind of initial processes, and they unfold in really, really similar ways, regardless of how much space you're given to do that. Now we can also reflect this another way here, where we're just overlaying the processes on one another. So this is essentially the same information that you just saw, but kind of all compressed into a single graph. What the prototypical, or maybe archetypal narrative structure looks like if we think about it as these 3 processes unfolding in verbal behavior. Now, this is great in and of itself that we can see this, and it's really remarkably reliable, although there is a lot of variation around these numbers. The error bars are still quite small, and it's really reliable across each of these different types of stories. So we were excited with that, but then it just kept raising lots of other questions. What does the structure actually mean? What does the structure actually tell us about this psychology, and specifically the social psychology of storytelling? Are deviations, are variations from this kind of prototypical structure, are those meaningful, and what does that mean? And you know, the next big question really for us was, how universal is this structure? Is this something that is really specific to stories, or is this something that we just see kind of everywhere in every type of verbal behavior? And the one that people proud us the most with was, does this structure tell us what was a good story? Is this what a good story looks like? And then do variations from this indicate that you're kind of failing as a storyteller, or that you're conveying information the wrong way to other people? So the second big research question we went after was that one. Does this structure tell us anything about how good a story is? And we collected a couple of additional corpora here. So the first was the administrators of the Open Subtitles database were really generous and pulled together a version of their database for us to use, which constituted, we cut it down using a lot of selection criteria to about 20,000. Essentially, they're not scripts, so they're the subtitles. So it's the type of stuff, if you flip on subtitles while you're watching a movie, that's what we have, the dialogue of the characters, not stage directions or anything like that. Of films, and these are films that span roughly 100 years all over the world, all of them translated to the English language. But really a huge diversity in time, context, culture, everything. And we also collected a decent-sized corpus of romance novels, and these are like basically exactly what probably comes to mind when you think of romance novels. These are like really kind of trashy, pulpy romance novels. Some professional, some amateur. And for all of these, we have reader and for the film case, viewer ratings of how much they like each of these. So for the film data, I pulled that from IMDb, and from for the romance novels, Smashwords has reader ratings for these. And so the big question was, do deviations from that normative structure tell us anything about what makes a good story? Do people like stories more if they fit this structure versus deviate from this normative structure? And just for a sanity check, when we look at the structure of these stories, on the left is the structure of these processes in films. On the right, the structure of these processes in the romance novels, and we see the same structures. Now, it's not too surprising. These are still fairly traditional kind of stories, so to speak. Film obviously is not as old as kind of the we'll say oral tradition of stories or the literary tradition of stories, but it comes from the same tradition in many ways. And then romance novels, we see some deviation, kind of like the thematic apperception test, the cognitive tension crests kind of early, but overall, in general, we see the same structures. And we try to understand whether or not deviations from these structures tells us anything about whether people like them more or less. We didn't really find a whole lot. I'm not sure how well any of this is going to show up on the audience's end. But when we break these into low, medium, and high rating groups for, I think on the top here, I'm trying to remember which one is which. The top is the romance novels, the bottom is film, so we have staging on the far left, plot progression in the middle, cognitive tension on the right. At a glance, what you can see is that there's really not much difference, especially for the romance novels, given the size of the error bars. Really, we don't see any serious differences in the structure of the stories as a function of whether or not people like them more or less. Now, there's some fancier stuff that we did here where we actually do find some differences, but it's kind of complicated, and we actually find opposite patterns for these. So for films, for the romance novels, those romance novels that adhered most closely to these shapes across all three of these narrative dimensions were more highly rated. So the more kind of archetypal the story structures were, the more people liked them. The opposite was true for the films. And, you know, really, I know that's not a super satisfying answer to the question of, does this structure tell us what makes a good or bad story? And I think that that's okay at this stage in this research. Really, what it comes down to, in a lot of ways, is that it depends. It depends on a lot of things. In particular, and this probably won't be any shock to the audience, is that it depends a lot on the context. It depends on the relationships between the storytellers and the audience. It depends on kind of how familiar they are with each other, what the audience's expectations are, given the different kind of genres and formats and so on. And that moves us into the third big question that we asked in this project was, how universal are these structures? So again, is this just kind of how verbal behavior works? Do people just start out with lots of articles and prepositions and concepts and interrelations, and then move into like pronouns and kind of action language and so on? Is this just how people talk and it's nothing specific to narratives or stories? And we looked at a bunch of different types of data sets here. The ones that I'll talk about here just in the most brief sense are, we looked at New York Times Science and Technology articles, TED Talks, and Supreme Court decisions. And ultimately, the take-home point here is that the shapes seem to actually vary a lot as a function of what type of text we're looking at. So unlike everything that I've talked about thus far, novels, short stories, TATs, films, romance stories, and so on, those are all very traditional stories in a lot of ways. Things like newspaper articles, Supreme Court decisions, TED Talks, these are very, very different, not just in the shapes of these structures, but really they're different from a social psychological perspective as well. When you go and see a TED Talk, your expectations are very, very different, and probably the speaker's goals are very different. And the same is true for Supreme Court decisions, where this is really these justices writing out their kind of analysis of a case and their logic of the decisions and so on. It doesn't really show up here. The figure on the far right for Supreme Courts is it's been normalized, so it looks kind of bombastic, but really the error bars, you can think about this also as very flat lines for staging process. On average, there's really not a whole lot of variation because the relationship between the speaker, the Supreme Court justices, and the audience is that they all share a legal background. I don't need to tell you the legal history of something if the only other people that's reading these decisions are essentially my peers and colleagues who already know the legal history of what I'm writing. So I'll wrap this up fairly quickly here, then we can move into actual discussion and Q&A. So the take-home points here is that what we're seeing is a common normative structure to narratives. Now, why that's the case, we don't have great answers for this yet. I have my own theories, and they seem reasonable to me, although I'm happy to hear any disagreement from this. You know, there's kind of a couple of competing issues here. My thinking is that one reason why we see these structures is that they're just kind of, I would say, optimal ways to convey information in the format of a narrative. So like I said before, if I start just telling you what happened without giving you the background information, it's really hard to actually soak up the meaningful information there, or even determine like what is meaningful. And that's true even for more artistic, kind of literary types of narratives, where it's hard for me to follow a story if I don't understand the characters' backgrounds and motivations and so on from a psychological perspective. Now, it may also be the case that these patterns are a bit maybe exaggerated or a little bit distilled over the past couple of hundred years. As you know, we're familiar with Freytag's pyramid, and a lot of us are taught to tell stories in these ways. So maybe this kind of reinforcing process where these stories are, the way that narratives are told, have an optimal structure, and we're taught them, so we just kind of lean into that, and it carries forward. The other big take-home point is that, you know, these structures seem to tell us a lot about the nature of the relationship between the speaker and the audience, how well they know each other, whether or not they have a lot of history and shared information already, or whether or not, you know, well, I'll just leave it at that. Now, we have a lot of future directions for some of this work. The big ones are implementation and deployment in different psychological domains. So I said at the very beginning that there's a long history of psychological research on stories and storytelling and how that relates to things like psychopathology and mental health and so on. And so we're very interested in seeing whether we can take these structures that we see in this type of verbal behavior and whether that tells us anything about people's senses of self and how that relates to their well-being and so on. We also want to move into a space where we can tell whether or not learning is facilitated by these types of structures. And if we vary these structures, does it influence what types of information people hang on to and so on. And I think I'll leave it at that and just kind of close up there and, just say the general, this research was highly collaborative, involving a lot of people and input over the years. And there's a lot of directions that we're planning on going with this. And you can read more about this. The paper will, in theory, be coming out sometime in the not too distant future. And there's also, we'd set up a website to kind of play around with some of this and explore some of it. It's not quite ready for prime time, so if anybody wants to play around with it, feel free to send me an email and I'll send you a link to it, and just keep it under your hat for time being. And that's it. Thank you.